Join us for ReCentered, an exclusive GCSP podcast series hosted by Nico Luchsinger.
Hello, and welcome to ReCentered, a limited podcast series from the Geneva Center for Security Policy. My name is Nico Luchsinger, and I'm a fellow here at the GCSP. So for the past 10 years, I have worked to help stakeholders in Switzerland understand developments in Asia and perspectives from Asia. And I often noticed how, in conversations with experts from the region, we focus on asking questions about the region only, while we here in Europe very naturally feel that we can comment on developments anywhere in the world. But if there is one thing that is clear to me in this world full of changes and upheaval, then it is that traditional centers of power are shifting, politically, economically, and culturally, towards regions outside of what we usually refer to as the West. And that means these regions increasingly have an influence on what is happening in other parts of the world, including here in Europe in the West. So the goal of this podcast is to explore these global shifts, but to do so in conversation with experts, analysts, and practitioners from these regions, from Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, or Asia. Each episode will feature a conversation with an expert, followed by a short assessment by a colleague from the GCSP of the topics discussed and what it means for us in Switzerland and Europe. And for this very first episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Suhasini Haidar, who is one of India's most respected and most prolific journalists. Suhasini is the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, one of India's leading newspapers, where she also hosts a show called Worldview with Suhasini Haidar. She's been a journalist for 28 years, winning numerous prizes along the way. Suhasini, welcome to ReCentered.
Thank you, Nico, and congratulations on the new show.
Thank you so much. Excited to have you on. So let me start maybe in a somewhat unusual way. There's a quote by an Italian writer called Antonio Gramsci, who wrote in the 90s while being imprisoned by the fascist regime of Mussolini. And he wrote in one of his diaries, "The old order is dying and the new one struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." And that quote, I've lost count of how many times somebody has sort of brought up this quote or sort of used this as a description of what's going on. My sense is that it's much more useful as an indication of the current mood, certainly here in Europe, than maybe as an analytical tool. So I'm curious to start by asking you whether this quote resonates with you. Does it capture the mood in India about the state of the world as well, or is this a more European-centric view that now is the time of monsters?
Nico, that is a really interesting question. And, it's about, it's like the Yeats poem that says more or less the same thing and then says the center cannot hold. Because not only are we seeing, I don't want to use the term monsters, but countries and leaders behaving in certain actions in a way that we had thought we had put behind us, that the world had moved beyond this kind of cruelty that we see around the world. But equally, we are in a time of great polarization. So that behavior, that cruelty, that those violations of normal human tenets that are finding some supporters as well. So they're finding on every one of these occasions where you say, this is not normal, this is not the world order, this is not the kind of principles we signed on to in the post-World War II 1945 world, we're equally hearing people saying, well, no, in this case it is justified, or what about that? Or as we heard the US President's top aides, Van Miller, say the other day, this is a time of might, this is a time of power. So yes, I do agree that this kind of defines our times.
The obvious big development internationally this year so far, obviously the year's only been a few weeks old by now, but the obvious big development was the removal of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro by US troops. And I'm curious, how do you assess what's happened in Venezuela? How are you explaining it to your readers and viewers? Like, what's the central argument that you're making of why this is happening and why it is happening now?
Well, it's interesting because so many parallels have been made between the action of the United States of sending a force into another country, basically kidnapping the leader of that country and bringing him back to their country to face their national laws. The fact is that this is being read in our part of the world as definitely a violation of international law, of the basic tenets of, respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity of another country to begin with. But I do think what makes this one interesting, and so parallels have been made to, say, Iraq, the U.S. Going into Iraq without a United Nations resolution in 2003, for example. Other parallels have looked at the 1989 kidnapping, similarly, of Noriega from Panama. But actually speaking, this is different because this isn't it isn't more than, I don't know how to say it, but a slight decapitation. It's a half decapitation because what we're seeing is the leader and his wife being taken away, but his immediate deputy being kept on as the leader. The military in Venezuela, which is all powerful, not being moved or challenged at all. Some even going to the point of saying that this seems to have been part of a discussion between the rest, the non-Maduro leadership of Venezuela and the Trump administration for perhaps a few months. So the word is still not out as to exactly how to read it. I can tell you in India, there was a certain amount of disappointment with the Indian government's official reaction, because that's the last part of what we're seeing, that because of what's happened in the last year with the United States putting out punitive tariffs, so many kinds of punishments on different countries, countries are now reacting much more only to that which affects them directly. And as a result, the Indian government's own reaction said it expressed concern about developments in Venezuela. It didn't really say what those concerns were or what the developments were. It didn't refer to international law, which is very different from the Indian reaction to previous incidents where they felt, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where India has been criticized for not being tougher. They talked about the international principles, sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference, and that kind of thing. But there was no reference to international law in the statement, and nor was there any actual direct reference to the United States. That's kind of becoming the sort of guiding principle now to how nations are reacting, which is to say, if it's not directly affecting me, maybe this is not my time to speak because the US is behaving in a certain way. And let's be fair, the entire P5 now behaves in a way which is not abiding by the rules. So whether it's Russia, whether it's China, and whether it is Europe, the UK and France, along with the United States, they're either enabling or themselves carrying out some kind of an operation that seems to contravene the older principles, if you like, of global governance.
It's interesting that you also brought up the comparison with the Ukraine case, because my sense was there's a certain sense of vindication in at least some parts of the Indian foreign policy establishment that, the Indian reaction to the Venezuela half decapitation, as you called it, was kind of muted. And then, of course, India has been criticized for years now, mostly from the Europeans, for its comparatively muted reaction on the war in Ukraine. So my sense is that the vindication now is that, India's been consistent, it's consistent in its muted reactions to both these cases. And it's vindicated now because, of course, the European reaction to Venezuela was also a lot more muted than you could maybe have expected. In a sense, do you feel does India, or at least maybe the Indian government, gonna feel justified by saying, we've that's sort of, they're basically now coming around to the approach that we've always had, which is, as you said, so as long as it's not like happening in your own backyard, then why should you care?
Nico, you remember that entire back and forth, if you like, with the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, when he said Europe's war is not the world's war. And those in Europe were extremely upset about this idea, saying these are global principles. But now we're more and more seeing that Europe's war is Europe's war. So when Trump threatens Venezuela or Iran, not so much of a reaction, but when Trump threatens Greenland, you're seeing armies being moved to support Greenland. So this fear that in this kind of moment of a global disarray, if you like, that we're becoming more tribal, more regional, more worried about what's our own backyard.
On the other hand, it seems to me that maybe Europe is coming around to a more Indian view of, or a view of the Indian government, I should say, of, of an interest-led foreign policy, and maybe one that's sort of less driven by global values or international norms. But it also struck me that the Indian reaction to Venezuela was relatively muted for a country that at various points in recent years has proclaimed to be the leader of the global South, assuming we'd count Venezuela to the global South, which I think we should. Then, you would kind of expect a stronger reaction from India. And it was notable again to me that the other country who claims to be the leader of the global South, China, had a much stronger reaction. So can we also read something into it, on India's positioning sort of in the global power structure, and maybe even read something into this vis-a-vis the India-China relationship?
I think, Nico, you have to look at it not so much from the prism of the India-China relationship right now, but from the position of the India-US relationship. At present, India and the US are seeing a strain in the relationship. That's the politest way to put it. The fact was, India was the first out of the bloc really to announce that they were going to launch free trade agreement talks or bilateral trade agreement talks with the US. A year later, those talks have not yet fructified. They have not yet been finalized, even though so many other countries have finalized their agreements with the United States. That's at the base of a lot of other tensions, US threats, the visas restrictions, the restrictions on Indian skilled migration as well, the kind of pressure we've seen on India's energy security, Russian oil in particular. India is today the highest sort of charged tariffed country by the US at 50%. Brazil is there, but Brazil has got more sort of loopholes. So at this moment, to be taking on the United States in the way China has does not seem pragmatic to India's rulers. I have to say that many of us have been critical of the Indian position, simply because the idea of giving in to a bully or somebody who might, use punitive action against you for criticism is a kind of self-enforcing game, because that just emboldens the bully. I will give you the example that many forget, that in 2017, 2018, Trump insisted that everyone give up oil from Venezuela. At the time, India was not only Venezuela a key supplier of crude. It is very heavy crude, but India has certain refineries that are meant for that Venezuelan oil. It made up to 10% at a time of India's energy basket, and India had to give that up cold turkey. It's a different phrase. At the same time, Trump had asked everyone to give up Iranian oil as well. Now, this was a light crude coming from very close to India and made up between 10 to 15% of India's oil and energy basket. And again, India had to give those up. So India had to give up two very important sources of oil at the time, which were cheap because of the sanctions on both countries, Venezuela and Iran. So when Mr. Trump comes back and now says, also give up Russia, you can imagine that there was a certain pushback. But by the time we have come into January 2026, and he's talking about Venezuela, it does not seem to be pragmatic. And I keep using that word because that's the word we've been given by trying to explain where India's position is. It is not pragmatic at this time to be taking on a situation where India's interests are limited by force, because India had to give up its interests in Venezuela 7 or 8 years ago, but also because there's hardly anything to gain from it. And India has a very real negotiation with the US to somehow resolve this trade deal issue that they don't want to in any way jeopardize.
Given everything you just said, and also given the realization, certainly from an Indian point of view, which I think that's absolutely correct, is that the very long developing relationship with the US is sort of has taken a turn this year. And while it's not entirely inconceivable that it would be repaired again and go back to where it was, that's certainly not something that anybody should expect happening in the years to come. I guess it makes sense for India to also look at alternatives. And in a way, my sense is the India-Europe relationship is one that we always talk about as having a lot of potential. But if you talk about something having a lot of potential for a long time, it also kind of implicitly says, well, that potential isn't being realized, which I think is exactly where we are with this relationship. But there is some momentum now. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz was in India quite recently. there's a EU-India trade deal that, sort of nearing the finishing line, it seems. And one of your colleagues, Raja Mohan, wrote this piece that I found interesting where he sort of proclaimed the Indo-Europe as kind of not as a formal alliance of a kind, but as a bond, right, that could exist between India and the European Union, but also individual countries in Europe, really not as kind of a replacement of anything. And that really seems to be also everyone's favorite word these days, as a hedge against what's going on. So my question to you is sort of like, how do you assess the Indo-Europe potential? And also maybe more specifically, what would India's expectations towards Europe be, right? Sort of what would Europe need to bring? How would Europe need to act to be a useful partner for India?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the Europe-India relationship is that rare sort of picture of hope at a time where there's very little else that's enthusing most of our countries on the subject of foreign policy. And, the German Chancellor's visit is unusual because there is an intergovernmental commission that we hold biannually, which Prime Minister Modi would have gone to Berlin for later this year in any case. So it was a very specific prioritization of the India-Germany relationship that we saw with his visit. It is followed by several European foreign ministers coming to India. We also the Polish foreign minister will be here. We're seeing the EU-India summit. And it's not just the summit. The European leadership, the EU Council and Commission presidents, Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa, are coming to Delhi for India's Republic Day. They're coming as the special guest, the chief guest at India's Republic Day parade. Now, that is quite an unusual sort of invitation, and unusual for it to be accepted, because they will literally be standing there shoulder to shoulder with Prime Minister Modi, making the point of an EU-India strategic partnership. Of course, many have pointed out that given that so much of India's hardware still comes from Russia, that they would also be, saluting the way the parade would also have quite a large component, including the flypast. But the point being that they are trying to make a political statement here. It's not just about the EU-India nuts and bolts of the relationship, but the political statement they're making. That'll be followed by the EU-India summit, where it seems fairly clear that they hope to have some kind of a document on the bilateral trade agreement that began to be negotiated 20 years ago, but hasn't yet reached the finish line. And then in February, we will see India hosting the AI summit, the Artificial Intelligence Summit, to which President Macron will be coming along with other European leaders and government officials as well, where again, they will be looking at very specific things India and Europe can do together. So I think that potential that you spoke about is now coming out in 2 or 3 different ways. One is in terms of just the bilateral trade between them, and a desire to de-risk not just China, but also the US now, because both have been scarred by the last year of the US behavior on trade in particular. So one is about the bilateral trade. The second is about technology and India really learning and benefiting from Europe's technological prowess, but also Europe benefiting from the potential of carrying out much of its manufacture and even design in India. 20% of semiconductor designers are really of Indian origin. We haven't yet gotten to that manufacturing stage, but there's a lot of potential in that India-EU relationship. There is a strategic partnership, and I think you'll hear a lot more about that in the next few weeks, and what they can do together, the Indo-Pacific strategy in particular, doing military exercises in the region together. There are a lot of colonial repast, if you like, of many European countries in the region, so they see themselves as Indo-Pacific leaders as well. But finally, what you should watch out for, which is this reconstruction of a global order. This year, India will chair the BRICS summit. France will be the G7 chair, so that's going to be in Europe. And the idea that together they can, with all these countries, sort of look at a new, an emergence of a new global order or some kind of framework that they can work with at this present moment, because it is clear that the UN order, as we see it, is not sustainable in the long term. It no longer represents the world. It no longer represents the population of the world, or as you pointed out, the fact that the center of gravity is moving eastwards in so many ways. It doesn't have a representative from all of Africa or all of South America in the permanent membership of the Security Council. So there are many places where reform is required. So can BRICS and G7 come together? That's going to be a longer question. I'm not sure that's very viable given I think the US in one and China in the other are not particularly. They're looking towards their G2 moment. So they're not looking necessarily at this new global order. But I think you'll hear a lot of these sentiments being put out where obviously we don't yet have agreement is on issues like Russia, issues like China. How big are those threats to the other side? And we saw that last year. India took part in military exercises with Russia in Belarus, and there was an outcry in Europe over it. So if even something like that is an area where they don't yet have, when they're not on the same page, you're going to see much more of that sort of underneath the surface, perhaps. But the differences between them, their worldviews, the idea that Europe has asked for certain support when it comes to Ukraine, but is not so affected by things that happen in other parts of the world, Israel and Gaza, for example. Those are all questions that India, as a member of the Global South, does ask.
You pointed out, right, that I think you did a very good job in sort of outlining, again, the potential of the India-Europe relationship, but then also, put on this caveat that India, while I'm sure it places a high value in the India-Europe relationship, and he pointed out sort of how this is manifested, is also a member of BRICS, is hosting the BRICS summits this year, which will be attended by, among others, a Russian delegation, which is, again, anathema to the Europeans. And so is kind of the expectation from the Indian side, in developing the India-Europe relationship, also to, sort of the expectation towards Europe is that we become better at compartmentalizing, that it is, well, you don't have to become a member of BRICS. Obviously, you wouldn't, but you would have to at least be okay with us being a member of BRICS and not, sort of they talk to us about the Russians all the time when we really want to, focus on developing our trade deals. Is sort of that, I think, is that kind of like the expectation level from the Indian side towards Europe, that sort of we're sort of breaking this up in maybe smaller, more manageable chunks, and we're okay, sort of with not being perfectly aligned on everything?
I think the key ask on both sides, and this is really both from the European side that we have heard as well as from India, is be sensitive to our concerns. And that cuts both ways. If you were following it, and I'm sure you were, President Putin made a visit to Delhi last month, and the European delegation was watching very closely. I think India showed a certain sensitivity to European concerns, whether or not that was something completely accepted in India, by not signing any big strategic agreements with Russia during the visit. Now, these annual summits normally always see some kind of an announcement on strategic issues. And yet we saw nothing on defense, nothing on defense cooperation, nothing on nuclear energy cooperation, and nothing on other strategic oil, other kinds of energy cooperation either. It seemed as if India was taking into account the fact that the European leadership was expected in Delhi and could not really, and wanted to be sensitive to that. In a similar way, India will expect that Europe understands its sensitivities. Obviously, some of the sensitivities are about the neighborhood, about India's own relationship with Pakistan, for example, that flares up every once and now, and the kind of conflict we saw last year on terrorism and getting full support on those kind of issues. But also some of it being sensitive to India's need to look at its national interest on certain equations. As I said, we are in this position where for 3 years, India said we will not consider the European request to cut its import of Russian oil. And yet today, because of the American sanctions, India is definitely cutting. India has now dropped to number 3 when it comes to Russian oil importers after Turkey now. And it seems as if there is a steady decline if you look from the middle of November to December, and now possibly the futures that have been put in for January and February are far lower. So I'm not saying that India will not do it. I'm just saying that for India, they are now in a position where perhaps they will have more in common with Europe. And certainly what's most important, as I said, is that no red flags should go up on either side. In other words, if we have each other's back, it's not necessary that we agree on everything.
I really like that formulation. So one can have each other's back, but you don't have. That doesn't mean you have to agree on everything. I'm continue to question as if that is the sentiment that is already widely shared among European political leaders. But I think that's precisely the point. Late last year, you actually were here in Switzerland, and you were speaking on a panel that had this impossibly broad question on the state of the world. And I think you did a really fabulous job. And I'll link to the video of this panel in the show notes as well. You talked about the state of the world by listing 5 absences. And I think a lot of these we've touched upon already. The absence of a body of global order, absence of rules, weakening of democracy. But there's one, when I rewatched this, that kind of stuck with me because I think it maybe would not have made a similar list from a European perspective. And that's, you said, we're seeing an absence of work. I'd love for you to maybe just explain what you meant by this and sort of how you see the absence of work or the threatened absence of work also play into the global order or the global disorder that we're experiencing.
Absolutely, Nico. And I think it is necessary for one to also see that, particularly from India's point of view, because India is now the most populous nation in the world. COVID showed us in a snapshot how easily the world could suddenly shut down and stop allowing, any kind of movement between countries. Now, obviously, that was a snapshot related to the pandemic. But it gave India a sudden jolt in realizing that it has to find jobs for its citizens over here. So one real challenge to that is the idea that as countries become more nationalistic, protectionist, and xenophobic, if you like, that India's labor is not finding as many welcome mats as they would have in the past. And by that, I mean both skilled and unskilled labor. The second is, and I think the government in India has really shown a sensitivity to this, the profusion of what are called mobility agreements now, which essentially mean that while countries will allow skilled labor from India to come in and will even welcome them, they are essentially not there for citizenships. They are going to come and they are going to then head back to India. I think that is a trend which is likely to last because it certainly suits those who are bringing that labor in to have a kind of consistent flow of skilled labor that they don't necessarily have a lifetime commitment to. This is how Indian labor has moved to the Gulf over the decades, if not centuries. We have 8 million, 9 million Indian skilled professionals and labor in the Gulf world. But what it essentially means is that when they are not in those jobs, that again, India will have to find work for its people. The third threat comes from artificial intelligence. And the idea that especially if you look at the US, for example, and its particular focus on artificial intelligence taking over some of the jobs that migrants would have done. This is a kind of consistent theme in what Mr. Trump has been saying and doing. Then again, that is a threat to Indians looking for work, and not just work, but to settle in the United States. Those doors are now closing, whether it is for students, whether it is for professionals. In the 50s and 60s, the US opened its doors to Indian doctors. In the 70s and 80s, it opened its door to Indian software designers, professional hardware creators, and all the rest. After that, we saw a certain almost shift to bring in others as well, the artists, the writers, and that sort of thing. We're seeing all those doors now closing one by one. And the question is, as Europe also follows suit. And we are looking at the political situation in Europe as country after country takes a right-wing turn, to realize that at least in the short term, if not in the very, very long term as well, that it is going to be more and more difficult for Indians to find those jobs abroad. So we're looking again at a region that is likely to go into turmoil, because this is a region with a lot of labor in it. Many of us have almost suggested that there should be a regional dialogue on this issue now, where instead of competing with each other to send migrants abroad or to send labor abroad, that we look much more at ensuring better conditions for all our labor. But I do think, Nico, that this is going to be the next generation's biggest challenge. If you're looking in South Asia, since 2020, we have seen the youth, the Gen Next, Z, if you like, coming onto the streets and pushing regimes out. Obviously, a lot of it has to do with the political situation in the countries, whether it's Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and all the rest. But a lot has to do with a generation that came through COVID, hoping that now there would be more jobs for them. Dependent on remittances. I mean, it's not a small amount that these countries base their GDPs on remittances, on exports, on tourism. So foreign remittances. And suddenly seeing that future seems very bleak. So I do think that the absence of work, particularly in our region, but I'm sure that's true of so many different parts of the world, is going to be one of the very challenging trends that we all have to deal with.
Before I stop the recording, just quickly ask, is there a topic that you think I should have mentioned that you would have loved to discuss that I didn't bring up, and a question that I should have asked you that I didn't?
Well, to be honest, I think you've covered most of it. I do think that there are going to be regional challenges for us. There are going to be challenges that are arising from the behavior of countries, as I said, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it's the US, Venezuela, China, and all the rest of that. But I think that we have to start focusing again, maybe. We no longer talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. Paris and the Climate Accord seems to be in trouble with the US walking out of it. But we still do have the challenge of global warming, the challenge of AI and deciding the rule making for AI, the ethics involved as we deal with an agentic AI, artificial intelligence that's really working as an agent that is bettering what humans can do and sometimes replacing human activity in certain respects. We need to have frameworks for all of these global challenges, whether it is the migration, whether it is other issues that come. And I think that that's where a lot of the focus has to come back. At some point, the US's, shall we say, unexpected behavior on every respect is going to peter out. We're going to have to, it will become a normal in a certain sense. But how is the rest of the world dealing with this? I can't tell you, Nico, how appreciative I am that you are having this dialogue and that you're having it with other parts of the world, because it's necessary for us to realize that we're dealing with a situation, but some of these challenges need to be dealt with by taking into account how the rest of the world are seeing them as well.
That was Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic editor of The Hindu. And I'm now joined by Thomas Greminger, the executive director of the GCSP, to discuss the themes of my conversation with Suhasini. Thomas, before we get into it, I recorded my conversation with Suhasini before the EU-India summit. Now, of course, you and I are speaking just shortly after the EU and India have announced a major free trade deal. In light of this big announcement, would you agree with Suhasini that Europe-India relations right now are what I think we refer to a rare bright spot in the world?
Oh, absolutely. And in that sense, Suhasini's perspective was absolutely correct, and I share that. It kind of resonates also very much with what we've been hearing in Davos. I think actors like India, the EU, middle powers, as Mark Carney has been referring to, I think they share common challenges. Suhasini said that both Europe and India are challenged by conducting a de-risking strategy with both China and the United States. And I think that's absolutely correct. But I think both also have an opportunity to team up, to work together when it comes to reshaping the international order, creating a fair, a more 21st century kind of international order. And in that sense, I see a lot of potential in this in Indo-European relation. I think, again, this is what Mark Carney referred to, that, these kinds of states, these middle powers, even though India cannot be considered as a middle power. India is probably rather an emerging major power, but still faces the same challenges as many middle powers. And I think, in a nutshell, what we are currently seeing in this Indo-Europe relation is that they are indeed not powerless.
One challenge that we also touched upon in the conversation with Suhasini within the relationship between India and Europe, of course, is India's relationship to Russia, and what seems like a clear European wish, if not to say demand, that sort of India kind of decide or pick a side. And my sense is that does not usually go very well with Indian diplomats who feel this would be an unreasonable ask to make, who feel that just because they want to have a good relationship with the EU or Europe doesn't mean they have to be fully aligned. How do you assess this tension? Again, you referenced the Mark Carney speech, right, which seems to suggest that we as Europeans maybe also have to start accepting that we have to build relationships and alliances with places like India, with whom we may not agree on everything and may disagree on some quite fundamental things.
I totally agree. I think we indeed have to be ready to compartmentalize, to be pragmatic. And again, I think that is a point that Carney made very clearly. We don't need to agree on every single thing. We need to identify common interests and then be driven by these common interests and build a relation. This may the coalitions and alliances that you build may then vary depending on the topic. Now, when it comes to Russia, I think what is important is that Indians would show some sensitivity to, let's say, the way we Europeans perceive Russia, in particular, as long as Russia is in a war of aggression against Ukraine. But at the same time, I think we Europeans also need to be sensitive to Indian interests. Russia has been a long-standing strategic partner of India, not least also when it comes to India's rival Pakistan. When you look at India's weaponry, well, this is still largely Russian. But also culturally, you have many Indians, that have done their studies in Russia. I think we need to respect these relations. We need to respect each other's sensitivities to an extent. And I think this is currently also happening. And I think Suhasini, she referred to what did not happen on the occasion of President Putin's visit to Delhi. And I think that's quite telling.
I absolutely agree. And I think this is a slow process. It just strikes me how complicated all of this gets when the Europeans, and I absolutely agree with you and with Suhasini, should start showing some, at least a level of understanding for the India-Russia relationship. It strikes me that, especially with a free trade deal that we're sort of gonna be seeing the details of in the next few weeks and months, hopefully. The problem is also this may actually partially inhibit Europe or the EU's ability to put economic sanctions on Russia, right? So some of these sanctions have been issued against Indian entities, and the question is what happens with those within a free trade deal. So the possibility for economic pressure on an adversary like Russia becomes a bit complicated if at the same time you build very close economic relationships with a country that then again has a very close relationship to your adversary. The other argument that did not come up in the Suhasini conversation, but that I hear a lot from Indian interlocutors, is that it's actually in Europe's interest that India has a relationship to Russia, because if it didn't and if it pulled back, then all this would be to drive Russia and China closer together. So it's really kind of a four-dimensional chess game that we all have to play now, because all these relationships start to become so complicated.
Yeah, again, I agree. And, if you build up a relation based on a set of interests, there are always trade-offs. And I think you will then have to weigh these trade-offs against, something that is more long-term, more strategic. And I think, again, after what we have seen in Davos, I think it is obvious, that actors like India, European states clearly have a strategic interest to work together, to be less dependent on these policies by the hegemons, by the three great powers. Now, of course, there is a price to pay for these relations. I mean, de-risking always comes at a certain price, but I guess it has become quite obvious that we should be ready to pay a certain price.
Maybe as a last question, you and I are speaking, and we're both in Switzerland. Switzerland already has a free trade agreement with India. How do you assess, sort of on a diplomatic and geopolitical level, the India-Switzerland relationship, and how will it be impacted by the fact that now India and the EU are also very clearly moving closer together?
It is less, of course, a comparative advantage than of Switzerland as compared with European competitors. I think that's perhaps the downside. But I think I would also see a positive side, and perhaps the positive side is even politically more relevant. I think it makes Europe beyond the European Union a more powerful actor. If I think in this current global environment of fragmentation and polarization, Switzerland will often be in a situation where it has to partner and team up with the European Union, with the rest of Europe. And so I think from a political point of view, basically seeing the EU now pulling in the same direction as Switzerland has been, I think that's a positive signal.
Thank you very much, Thomas Greminger, for joining me here on the first episode of ReCentered.
Thank you.
And that's it from this very first episode of ReCentered. My name is Nico Luchsinger. This episode was produced by Florian, Golay, William, Tavelli, and myself. Thank you so much for listening in, and I do hope to see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to ReCentered, GCSP's exclusive podcast series. The views, information, and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals concerned and do not necessarily reflect the views of the GCSP or its partners.